Hello and welcome to Our Bookseller with me, Stephen Andrews, and today I'm with the very wonderful Richard Rempel of Vintage SF, who I hope you know and love. And if you're not watching Richard's channel, you should be. There will be a link below. And Richard's in Canada, I'm here in England, so it's a transatlantic thing again. And we do like these conversations, don't we, Richard?
We do.
We do. And
It's great.
something which I wanted to talk about was Richard's very fond of John Wyndham, who was my sort of first major love as an SF writer. I was a total Wyndham fan. I know Richard is as well. And something which I've long been fascinated by when I speak to people from North America about Wyndham is that Wyndham, of course, is incredibly English. And that comes across to me. And I'm not English, I'm Welsh. Obviously, Wales is part of the United Kingdom, so I was never far from England, and I live in England now. But he was always an attraction. So the things which really make Wyndham and his ilk interesting to me are possibly different to somebody in the States. So I wanted to talk to Richard about this, because for those of us who are British, we tend to relate to the landscape in Wyndham, to the concept of a small island, which has had many sort of battles and invasions and what have you over the years, and really to get under the skin of that. And I wanted to ask Richard, you've really enjoyed things like when you did your sort of 2-year roundup recently, you mentioned The Death of Grass as one of your favourites, which is a bit darker than Wyndham, though Wyndham does have its dark moments. And what fascinated me about that was that I like this book, but of course the landscape is completely devastated in it. So what is it about narratives like this, and like, for example, The Day of the Triffids, which really grab you as a North American? I mean, how do we, because I can explain it from a British perspective, but how can we explain it from the perspective of somebody in North America? How does it work?
Well, thank you for having me on. Like you said, I always appreciate having a conversation with you. I did from middle school start to find Wyndham and read Wyndham. I think there's something here about the history of our countries. One of the things I've done in travel is go to Europe, and all of a sudden I realize, in Canada and United States, things are really old if they're 100 years old. But in Europe, it's 1,000 years. And I think there's a depth of history that Britain has, or that the UK has, that is missing from North America. And then there's, I think, even a difference between Canada and the United States, because Canada was a colony of Britain, but they rebelled, formed their own country. Canada didn't. We have a different sort of relationship, I think, with Britain and France than United States does, because of the way our history played out. And I remember in school seeing Queen Elizabeth up there, and we even sang "God Save the Queen" at the, I believe it was at the end. No, at the end of the day. I think we said "O Canada" at the beginning of the day, and then "God Save the Queen" at the end of the day. So first off, I think there's a context for our cultures and history, and because there's a connection with Canada and the UK, we would even get some of the TV programs from the UK. I just want to say that's kind of like an underlying theme here that I think comes into play. The next part, though, is for myself, I grew up in a rural community. My first school was 2-room schoolhouse with 6 grades in it. So that rural upbringing really attracts me to novels, catastrophe novels, where something goes wrong, but we find, how do you stay safe? How do you rebuild a community? How do you make your way through this? And I believe you grew up in a very small community as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because in a way, the community you grew up in was more rural than mine. It's even though it is broadly rural, and where I come from now is quite rural. There are cities nearby and there are towns nearby. And I grew up in industrialised South Wales, and even though I lived halfway up a mountain, it was only 10 minutes walk to civilization, but it was far enough to make a difference with my peers. But it's an interesting thing you mentioned there, because there is that thing about perhaps Canada is more Francophile and more Anglophile because of those connections, as opposed to the USA. And the rural thing, I mean, we think of great North American narratives like George R. Stewart's Earth Abides, which has that very pastoral thing. And also things like, have you ever read Alas Babylon by Pat Frank?
I have.
Yeah?
Yes.
I haven't read that for a long time. And again, when reading it, I remember thinking, okay, well, the apocalypse has happened, but everybody's okay. And it's that thing about the cozy catastrophe. And I wanted to share a few books with you, and some of which you might have read, some of which you might not have, which underline my thinking, and probably the thinking of the average British SF fan of a certain vintage, which is, I'm going to show you a book now which you may not know, and I've wanted to show it on the channel for ages, so I'm rather springing something on you. And this book is quite hard to find now. There are print-on-demand editions. There hasn't been a regularly published mass-market edition since 1980, and the edition I have in my hand, which I'll show in a moment, was printed in 1980, and this went out to print probably about 10 years after that. And this is the book. This is After London, Wild England by Richard Jefferies. Have you ever come across that?
No, I haven't.
This is an obscure book these days, obviously because it was last printed 45 years ago. And as you see, this is an Oxford World's Classic, and I bought this in the late 80s, and it went out to print shortly after that. And this really is kind of, in my view, the ur-text of the Great English Catastrophe Novel, as I call it. Now, I'm calling it that because secretly I've been writing or trying to write a novel called The Great English Catastrophe Novel. And I'm mentioning that now to kind of quasi-copyright it. So if somebody else steals the title, then they know I was doing it first. But there you go, beside that. So this is really interesting because I see this. I think if I ever see a copy of it, I'll pick it up for you and I'll send it to you. But it's quite hard to come by. And Richard Jefferies was a ruralist writer. He was a English nature writer, really. He's very good at writing about nature. He was around in the mid-19th century, and this was published in 1885. And he spent some time in Swindon, which isn't too far from here, which is quite an urban place these days. And this posits a future. So this came out in 1885, and the future that has come, there has been technology beyond the technology of 1885. There's been flying machines and what have you. But it's further on, and there's been a kind of catastrophe. And the writer of this, there's two parts. It's really quite strange, because the first part of it is called The Relapse into Barbarism, and it has 5 chapters, 40 pages, which talk about the way that England is after this unspecified catastrophe. And you don't know who the narrator of it is. And it goes into the animals and what happened. And one suggestion is that there was some heavenly body that moved near to the earth, upset the axis, and caused the collapse. And London sort of collapses into pestilence. People move out of the country. The upper and moneyed classes leave Britain, hinted that they go to America, but that doesn't work out either, leaving ordinary people behind. And it collapses into barbarism. Then 40 pages in, you get a narrative which is called Wild England. So as you see, it's After London, Wild England. And the central character is a guy called Felix. And Felix Aquilona, I think it is. He is an ordinary guy who becomes eventually a kind of chieftain in an England which reminded me a lot of, I know that you read this because I sent you a rather ratty copy of The Chalk Giants by Keith Roberts, which I know you and I enjoyed, and is a fascinating, if difficult, book at times. And this has sort of overshadowed a lot of the catastrophe novels I read, and it's kind of the granddaddy of them all. And when you read it, it feels more like a fantasy novel because everything's gone very medieval again, and there isn't much tech in it, and everything's feudal. And a huge lake has opened up in the sort of southern centre of England. Parts of Wales have flooded, the Welsh have conquered Cornwall, Dorset, and parts of the West Country. All sorts of things happen. And interestingly, looking over this morning, the first time I'd looked at it in depth for years, it reminded me of, have you read any of these? Richard Cowper's White Bird of Kinship series?
Not yet. I do have a couple copies.
Yeah, there's a few of these, and in that there's been this flood, or the sea level has risen, and parts of Britain are underwater. And it's a similar thing to this. So this is kind of the daddy of them all. And um, Jeffreys was he was a kind of proto-socialist, and he was very much about the countryside, and you could tell in his writing. He's known really as a nature writer, and funnily enough, this to me is his key book. He wrote a book called Bevis, which is a children's book about a little boy who could talk to animals, and a love of the natural world comes across. And there's an ambiguous ending, but it's also quite gloomy. So it's kind of the thing really which started all these sort of things that we know and love, you know, the Wyndhams and the Christophers and the Keith Roberts. It kind of started them all off in a way. So that's what I wanted to introduce to you. So it's that thing. I mean, catastrophe fiction, people love the end of the world, don't they? We find that an interesting thing. And it made me think of some other things. So I know you've read some Adam Roberts, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
You read some? Yeah. I mean, I am just dropping things on you now. This is an excuse to show some books. But are you familiar with The Snow by Adam Roberts?
I actually have a copy, but haven't read it.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. And as it suggests, it's about a huge snowfall. And funnily enough, which destroys civilization, as you'd expect.
That'd be good for Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine. I've got friends in Colorado as well, and they tell me about the extremes there. And they're both British, and they both live in different parts of Colorado. They don't know each other. But in this, funnily enough, in this copy, at the back of it, there's a little 4-page piece called The Great Snow, which was written about 10 years before the book. And in that, he describes a massive snowfall, and that sort of destroys London. So that was kind of like a dry run. So Richard Jeffreys, who everybody's watching, After London, Wild England, watch out for that. If you see any edition, pick it up, because it is kind of an ur-text. So in Britain, I think it's very much about that landscape thing, like you have in Canada. But it's also an island thing as well, because we're small. So thinking about the North American catastrophe novel, is it just that I'm not as aware as I should be of the more obscure works, but is there anything which comes to mind in the catastrophe canon that you think should be more widely read that is from the North American perspective?
Well, you know, as you say, I think that actually I would not be surprised if we ever had such a catastrophe. We really wouldn't know what happened. All of a sudden power would go off and communication would be gone. And almost all of them deal with leaving big cities and going to the country. And I mean, I think of that in a North American version too, where we have The Long Tomorrow by Lee Brackett, where United States is falling apart. It's a nuclear war type of disaster. And the rural Mennonite communities are in a great position getting started in terms of having places to live. And they write a new constitution amendment that says you can't have larger communities than a certain size because they don't want to become targets or develop technology so that something like this would happen again.
That's similar. When I read that book, I naturally kept thinking of Canticle for Leibowitz with the sort of cyclical history thing. And the nuclear sort of side of that. And interestingly, it's funny with this, when you read the White Bird of Kinship books, they begin quite multifaceted and it narrows down. And you'll be reminded of Keith Roberts. You'll also be reminded of Miller as well, I think, because there's quite a strong religious thing in this, which is interesting. And it's sort of high time really somebody should do these in an omnibus because they are good. I mean, Cowper is quite a gentle writer, not as powerful as, say, Roberts or Priest, but he's well worth reading. But I don't know, again, something which has happened more recently. I'm going to show you another book. This is just for you. We have a conversation really about these books. Have you come across this series that Dave Hutchinson and Adam Roberts have been doing?
No, I haven't. I've heard John of Sci-Fi Scavenger has talked about those books.
Yeah, and these are interesting because what happened with these, there's going to be 4 of them. There's been 3 so far. And Solaris, the publisher, they actually contracted Dave Hutchinson and Adam Roberts to write these. They weren't things that the guys came up with. They actually were contracted to write these. And I thought that was interesting because that was such a sort of retro step for a British contemporary SF publisher to request catastrophe fiction, and you would love these. They are really good. There's 3 of them so far, and the first 2 were published within a year of each other. When did this come out? There's been quite a hiatus between the second and third. Let's just have a look. This was 2018. Funnily enough, this is signed by Dave. I'd forgotten that. And the Adam Roberts one came a year later, so they're doing 2 each. And they're set in this 200 years in the future, and there's been a meteor strike which got through the Earth's defenses, and it's destroyed civilization. It's all very pastoral. But of course, with Dave Hutchinson and Adam Roberts, you get quite a lot of wit as well. So they're good ones to watch out for. So that was a really interesting retrospective step, but they put a different cover livery on the third one. And the third one is print on demand, a mass market. It's come out new from Solaris, but it's print on demand. It's really bizarre. So yeah, I know John had written, but that was one which had really sort of come up and taken my eye. But
You might, can I go to a point that you made a little bit earlier?
yeah, of course, yeah.
I think what you were saying about UK being an island, your country could almost fit within my province in terms of the size of it. And North America is just so wide and large. And I think of George R. Stewart's The Earth Abides. He has a travel log where he goes across the country trying to see if there's people still alive or not, and then comes back to California. Yours seem that have that coziness because it is a smaller country, smaller confined space, smaller places that people go to, whereas it becomes that exploration of the New West from the 1800s almost becomes Western style fiction when it comes to North American apocalyptic type literature, I think.
It's more like pioneer narrative then again.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
It is interesting because thinking about this, I pulled a few things off, and again, I'm sure this is a book you have. I don't know if have you read Greybeard by Brian Aldiss yet?
I have it, but have not read it. You're much more widely read than I am.
Yeah, well, a lot of these I read a long time ago, but I mean, this is another one, which is because, of course, speaking of Wyndham, Aldiss was the guy who said that Wyndham wrote cozy catastrophes. And I like Aldiss and Wyndham. And I don't actually, and this is a strange one because the idea in this is that there's some sort of cosmic accident, there's cosmic radiation, and everybody's sterilized. So no children are born on Earth for decades and decades. And it looks like the human race is going to die out. So all the characters are elderly people, and they're set around Oxford and the Thames Valley. And it's very pastoral and rural. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. And it's quite funny because it's actually a lot more cozy than anything Wyndham wrote. So, do you think Wyndham is that cozy? I don't. I have to say, I think he sort of confronted all sorts of difficult things to me. What do you think?
I would agree with you. And what I think you mentioned earlier this last week or whenever this airs, Lost World is one of your favorite novels of all time. It came to you at the right time from Arthur Conan Doyle. Some of the writing of early English popular authors like Doyle or Wells, I felt like Wyndham's voice was coming from there, and that was very different than Canadian and North American literature.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure if I can describe it. I don't think the situations were cozy. There was lots of dire threat in what was going on and some very interesting ideas being expressed and very interesting conclusions to these stories. But there was the way of relating it that it felt like you could be sitting by a fire with, a cup of coffee or a goblet of wine and reading this book and feeling like you're in a beautiful place here, even though it was the end of the world. Yeah, and I don't always feel that way with American literature.
No, I think it's funny because I think it's that sort of British parochialism, that tone, which I think is very prevalent in my favorite Wyndham book, which is The Midwich Cuckoos. And of course, it's happening in a little village, and you've got this very urbane philosopher, Zellaby, who all the way through the book, everybody is pondering and asking the questions, what's the right thing to do? And this threat is growing and growing. And it seems very, very cozy indeed. But the threat to the villagers as the children grow in their psi powers becomes more and more and more of a terrible thing. And I think very often in the real world, that's how things emerge. They emerge slowly and they snowball. And of course, the thing which fascinated me, and I didn't get the reference when I was young, but I got it later on when I became more sort of culturally aware, is that the final chapter of Midwich is called Zellaby of Macedon, which of course is a reference to Alexander the Great. And the way that Zellaby has come up, he's been pondering this moral question, what is the right thing to do? And he leaves the letter for his wife about survival. And he has to cut the Gordian knot. The challenge, the moral challenge of what you do about the children is this big tangled knot which nobody can undo. Then he acts like Alexander the Great and cuts it by doing what he does. And that seemed to me anything but cozy. It was just the actual thing in itself isn't cozy. It's the sort of the way that it's the cachet, the way it's couched. And Wyndham obviously was really popular with female readers as well, and with the general public in Britain. And you've read, when you read, what was the one that Popular Library, they repackaged Jizzle, didn't they, recently? And you reviewed it. What is the title of it?
Let's see if I can find it here. It was, there is a second novella that was in there that hasn't been published before.
Yeah.
I can't quite recall
and
the name.
And they retitled the book after one of the other short stories, didn't they?
But they also have, Trouble with Lichen too, with a very a protagonist who is a woman scientist in 1960. That
absolutely.
That seems very progressive to me. And the other thing about him that I think was very interesting to me is there was a lot of sort of common sense decisions, even the hard decisions, were reasoned in a calm manner. There wasn't panic and rash decisions and then dealing with the consequences of rash decisions. That doesn't often happen in a Wyndham novel.
Yeah, I think that's the case. So I don't see him as being that, because as you say, when we talk about John Christopher, that's anything but cozy, and in a similar way. But it's to me, it goes in steps. People say they love catastrophe novels, but there aren't really that many good ones. There's Wyndham, then you get this takes it a step, and then Ballard takes it to its psychological conclusion. But so it was quite nice to see, for example, as I said, we're going to see these coming up again. But it has made me think about how people like those narratives and what they actually mean, and how they've largely disappeared from SF discourse. But I wanted to refer to two more books, and this is as much for the benefit of the audience as anybody else. And one which came to mind when I looked at the Richard Jefferies. Funnily enough, this is edited and with an introduction by John Fowles, who was very sort of pastoral ruralist writer himself, and a big influence on Christopher Priest. But he mentioned in the introduction this book, News from Nowhere by William Morris, the great English craftsman, all-round sort of, he could do everything. He was a kind of an artistic polymath. He could paint, he could write. He wrote sort of fantasy novels, sword and sorcery novels. This was his socialist utopia, which is very pastoral. I haven't read that for years and years and years. That came to mind. But it also made me think about, when you're in a small country, what do you do for a small place? What do you do for the forbidden territory? And talking about those North American narratives, post-apocalyptic, where it becomes like a new frontier, as you said. In the UK, we wouldn't have that so much. I'm sure we'd have just as many problems, with sort of warring clans and what have you, and trying to get resources. But it made me think of this book, which I haven't reviewed this on the channel. This is somebody who deserves more attention because he's quite interesting. This is The Breach by M.T. Hill. He also did a book as Matt Hill, a book called Lamb, which I have reviewed on the channel. And The Breach came out 5-6 years ago. This is about his third or fourth book. And this is about urban exploration, urbex, where people go into buildings and places which they shouldn't do because they're dangerous. And that made me think of zone novels like the Strugatsky brothers and Jeff Vandermeer. And I guess in the UK, when we're looking for unexplored places, we have to go into urban exploration. So this is an urban exploration SF novel that's well worth a look at if you can get it, and very, very unusual. So maybe that's all that's left to us, and perhaps that's why, and this is coming to me now as I speak, perhaps that's why in Britain from about the 80s onwards, science fiction writers got more and more interested in what the sort of postmodernist writers call liminal spaces and edge lands and what have you. And that infected the work of people like M. John Harrison and so on. So maybe in Britain, we're disappearing into our post-industrial landscapes, which are tiny sort of enclaves here and there, which are all we have left of mystery of our landscape.
I think in some ways we are craving the return to a more smaller community of everyone knows everyone, but we're also craving a civilization. And so a lot of these novels seem to be that journey to try to find that destination. But I think that novel you just talked about sounds like there's also that adventure of leaving that little enclave and discovering the wider world, discovering the technology that there used to be, or the great things that used to happen, or why are we this way? What is our history? How did we become this?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing about this is that the central character in this, in one of these spaces, he discovers something. He does discover something. And strangely, and I don't want to sort of mislead people what this is like, but because it's far, far subtler, this reminded me in various ways of a film called Q, the Winged Serpent. Are you familiar with that? Q, the Winged Serpent by Larry Cohen, which is a bizarre but very entertaining film about a guy who discovers that there's a giant flying reptile nesting in the top of the Chrysler building in New York. I mean, it's hidden in the middle of one of the world's biggest cities. This is about something else that's hidden, but it's subtler. But it did remind me of that. So if you ever see this, pick it up. It's just really quite interesting. I should do a proper review at some point. But yeah, it is interesting to talk about those differences. And the pioneer thing has really got me thinking now. So I'll have to go back to the North American classics of post-apocalyptic literature and keep that in mind when I reread them. Thanks a lot, Richard, for appearing on the channel. Brilliant to talk to you as always. And I'm going to sign off now. Thanks to everybody for watching. Thanks again to Richard. Do watch Richard's channel. He's one of the best people on YouTube. Charming fellow, as you can see. And his videos are really, really good. He's covering a lot of the great works. And I think he's got impeccable taste. So, and to those of you watching, as you know, thanks for watching. And I'll see you again soon. Bye from me and bye from Mr. Rempel.